Alright. Anima watched with suspicion. Alright, let me get centered over my keyboard here so my hands don't hurt so much. Anima watched with suspicion as Knowles Daylock emerged from another tent that wasn't his. She did not trust this knight. No one in the northern stretches. Let me spell that right. Let me go back and spell a few things right while I'm here. Wouldn't that be fun? What was I trying to spell? With suspicion? Oh, I got two words together. That's what was going on. Alright. Let's see if we can make it through two sentences without a problem. No one in the northern stretches really trusted the kingdom at all. Out here, you had to look out for yourself and your own family. Anima had 4 younger sisters, and with her parents gone, they were her responsibility, even though she was only 16 years old. Say apart from being distrusting of knights, Knowles was something less trustworthy altogether. If knights were supposed to be under a system of honor. Alright, let me fix a typo here. If knights were supposed to be under a system of honor, Knowles Daylock was lacking in the currency. That might explain why this lone knight had been sent out into these distant territories. So far north of the capital of the kingdom of Valahark. Alrighty. As he made his way up the trail, others cheered his passing. Anima knew many of them did not speak as positively as this behind his back, but they feared upsetting the Knight of the Kingdom. The royal family's representative in their midst. Anima had no intention of lowering herself, even just to pretend. He was supposed to be here to protect them, but he only seemed interested in being in the company of whatever girls or women were willing to show him attention. Anima's only concern with Knowles was keeping him away from her and her sisters. As he turned to wave on his way up the trail into the hills and jagged mountains for a supposed patrol, she thought maybe their eyes had connected for a moment. He seemed to linger on her, and she wondered if he saw some of her hate in whatever dark stare she was giving him. Her grip tightened on her bow as if she intended to use it, and he looked away as he left their settlement behind. He probably did not notice her at all, she told herself, and he would be back eventually. One of her sisters let out a cry behind her, and Anima spun about, forgetting all about the dishonorable knight and his patrol. It was Tova, the youngest, at 10 years old. Too old to to be squealing over something silly. So Anima ran through the camp with all her might. When she arrived at their shelter, made of thick logs and cured skins, built on a platform against an isolated outcropping of rocks. When she arrived at their shelter, made of thick logs and cured skins, built on a platform against an isolated outcropping of rocks, she saw the other three sisters pulling Tova away from the shelter. Let me change that to Tava, as in rhymes with lava. I feel like I've seen the name Tova before in some other fiction, so I want to differentiate a little. Alright. Okay. Saga, 1 year younger than Anima herself. Grudge at 14. Okay, let's list off all the sisters here. Bitter at 12. And then young Tava were all accounted for. None of them seemed injured, although they did look scared and disheveled. The noise within the shelter continued. Some type of animal, she assumed. What happened? Anima asked. At first, none of her sisters had anything to say, and she was about to repeat her question when they all shouted at once. Goblin. Of course, Anima knew the word. Goblins were one of many feared groups up here in the northern reaches. Supposedly, was what the knight was for whatever he was truly worth. Goblins raided in groups, though. Their presence raised an alarm through the entire camp. Everyone rallied to defend, whether Knowles was there or not. The scouts and lookouts typically gave forewarning, and the raiding parties of goblins would usually retreat to go bother some lone travelers or less prepared camps instead. Say smaller. Less prepared camps instead. So she thought she had misheard. Goblins all packed into their little shelter that was crowded when the sisters were all asleep. Again, she was about to ask them what was going on when a lone small goblin burst forth from the flaps of the opening. Several of their cooking items scattered. Okay, let me fix a spelling error there. Some of their cooking items scattered. Alright, let's see if I can fix that. In its wake. He had a number of other things piled together in his arms. None of it was terribly valuable, but they would be things hard to replace for Anima and her sisters surviving on their own. At the last moment, she swung her free arm at the goblin and caught him with an elbow. attack was more of an instinct reflex than a conscious choice. It still knocked the wind out of the little creature. The small goblin flipped over in the air, and all their stolen things scattered around him as the small goblin flipped over in the air and all their stolen things scattered around him as he bounced 3 times. Let's see, Anima. Okay, we'll make this a new paragraph. Anima shouldered her bow and took a small club with a heavy head on the end, on its end, off her belt. It was hanging next to her sword and was for just such a situation where she did not want to waste an arrow and didn't quite believe that a sword was called for. Were there more goblins? She certainly would have drawn her sword at the very least. She scanned around for more of them and listened for a general alarm. But she saw and heard nothing. Maybe the creatures around them were getting desperate. It had been drier than usual, and it was only getting colder as the seasons progressed. Goblins had little problem with cold, but they still needed to eat, and they had to compete against other packs of awful things all through these hills, including rock giants themselves. She was glad not to have to deal with. She was glad not to have to deal with. Where do I go with this? She was glad not to have to deal with a whole raiding party. But if they were getting desperate enough to come one at a time, that might be a new problem. The smaller of these creatures could slip past the the lookouts. Lookout is somebody that watches the hills. Outlook is a email system. Alright, the smaller of these creatures could slip past the lookouts, just as this one had apparently done. And even the little monsters could still cause great trouble. The goblin jumped up from the ground and sprung right at her in attack. She swung the club. Let's say her sisters screamed in surprise. She swung the club and caught him hard across the side of his head. He let out a weird groan as he spun away in the air. A human taking that blow to the head might never get up again. A human taking that blow to the head might never get up again. A human taking that blow to the head might never get up again. Goblins were hard-headed things, though. This one snatched up a clay bowl from the ground and ran. It was a small thing, and probably they would hardly notice it was gone. But it was theirs. And Anima chased after the goblin. She shouted over her shoulder. Okay, let me fix that. She shouted over her shoulder at her sisters. Clean this up. The goblin dodged between tents and even through the legs of shocked people. Anima ran hard behind him and even managed to close the distance. "Drop it," she ordered. "Don't you break it, or I'll break your skull." All right. He cleared the camp, cleared the edge of camp as he bounded over the same trail that Sir Knowles de Locke had wandered down. Of course, that useless knight was nowhere around. Anima was right behind the creature and raised her club to bring the thief off its feet. Let's say off his feet. She caught a whiff of some awful smell that set warning bells off in her head. Anima pulled up short and let the creature keep running between several rocks leading down a slope and away from the camp. The little goblin slowed down and even seemed to be waving the bowl as if inviting her to keep chasing. She backed away slowly, cutting her eyes from side to side. Returning her club to her belt, she debated between her sword and her bow, as several sets of yellow and green eyes rose up from around the rocks. She took her bow and notched an arrow. The larger goblins growled and showed their sharp teeth. They had clubs and other weapons of their own. No bows or arrows, though. No spears either that she saw. They started to climb out over the rocks. She thought about warning them off, maybe threatening them. Instead, she drew and fired an arrow into the thigh of the largest goblin, just above its bent knee. It let out a grunt. It let out a grunt and acted like it was going to keep coming anyway. As it shifted its weight, the wounded monster tumbled down into the space between rocks where the goblin party had been trying to lure her. The others hesitated as she continued to back away and notched another arrow. In addition to the one she prepared, she held a couple more between her fingers, so she'd be ready to hurt even more of them. Their hesitation didn't last long. They started to advance again. Anima let fly, and before the next arrow even hit, she notched and fired two more, one right after the other. These arrows found more fatal places around the goblins' heads and necks, these would not recover as easily as the first one with an arrow in his leg. The others kept coming, but each sort of waited for the other to lead out. Anima took the opportunity to draw more arrows and to back away further. You can keep the stupid bull, she said. For whatever reason, they took that as an invitation to charge. She fired her arrows and ran sideways instead of back toward camp. The goblins made the turn and pursued. She found another outcropping of rock to climb up and shelter within. Goblins tried more than once to get up at her, and she plugged them with arrows for their troubles. They kept their distance, but circled under and around her rocks, looking for another way up. This was her signal to slip out. As she took the narrow pass through the rocks that she knew well from childhood, she managed to get out and ahead of the goblins. This was good because Anima was running out of arrows. She needed to hunt soon and would have to make more. Worse than having to carve more arrows was the fact that parties of goblins were venturing this close to camp. She heard them howl behind her, and she started to run. They had found her. Anima reached the edge of camp, shouldering her bow and drawing her sword. Close combat with goblins was a good way to lose a finger to their sharp teeth. But she wasn't going to let one of them pass to get into the camp, nor to her sisters. Hey, is there something I can read it from the beginning since I just got here? I'm just writing it now as I go. It's going to be free on my Patreon later on, and that'll probably be the first time it publishes. I guess you could go back to the VOD once it's out. I got some other stories up on Patreon too, and we'll be doing one story. We'll have one story a day in October, so lots of stuff there. This one will be up later though. I'll share the link once it goes up, but that may be a little while. But she wasn't going to let one of them pass to get into the camp, nor to her sisters. Alright, what's next? The general alarm sounded. Well, I could spell that correctly instead of wrong. No problem at all. The general alarm sounded with horns from more than one lookout. The goblins' howls had finally let everyone know what was going on. Others from camp moved up along beside her with blades, axes, and clubs of their own. Surviving goblins pulled up short and started growling as they hopped around. The humans shouted insults, threats, and curses back. This standoff continued for a while. Something large and loud whistled through the air over their heads. The goblins went silent and then quickly retreated. Anima looked up, dreading what awful thing might have come for them from the sky. It was a bull. Giant stone bull flying through the air. Like everyone else, she stood and stared as the flat thing skipped across the grass and came to rest at the far end of the camp. She checked once more to be sure the goblins were really gone. Whatever this was, they wanted no part of it. Anima joined the others. Anima joined the others in walking up toward the spot where this thing had landed. She saw her sisters going to check it out and whistled for them to come to her side. She looked back into the high hills and the misty mountains beyond and wondered what was large enough to throw something this big that far. By the time they reached the giant bull, the people who got there first lifted Sir Knowles de Locke onto a woven stretcher and moved him to one of the tents. He appeared to have run into quite a bit of trouble even before some giant threw him all the way back to camp. Better him than me, she muttered. One of the elders approached her from the tent and asked, "Would any of you be willing to nurse our knight back to health?" before her sisters could respond, Anima spoke for her family. None of us will be going anywhere near him. She expected an argument, but the elder simply moved on to ask someone else. It appeared they were aware of this knight's reputation. Anima walked her sisters back to their shelter as she scanned the surrounding hills for any creatures, say monsters, any monsters, great or small. Things were changing and the danger was growing. All right, there we go.